Well, welcome back to another Bourbon Riders podcast. Tonight's topic, 5 popular bourbon myths busted. Well, it wasn't too long ago that I was trying to come up with topics for our podcast series, and I thought about bourbon myths. So this weekend I did some research and I came up with 5 that I think are pretty common bourbon myths that if you weren't a bourbon connoisseur, you probably would believe it's true. Now, you guys have been drinking bourbon a long time. You know they're not true. And you'll probably go like, yeah, I've heard that one. So tonight's podcast is unofficially brought to you by Widow Jane Decadence. Cheers. If you haven't tried the Widow Jane Decadence, you should look it up. It is worth its weight in gold. So, 5 popular bourbon myths busted. Well, the first one that I thought was, and it seems to be pretty predominant out there, especially in the non-bourbon circles, that all bourbon comes from Kentucky. Yeah, some people believe that. No. And how do I know that? I've got 4 very good examples right here to show you. First up, Short Barrel, a distillery in Atlanta, Georgia. Not from Kentucky. John J. Bowman. Now this is their single barrel from A. Smith Bowman Distilleries, Virginia. A wonderful bourbon company. Next one, if you're into 4-grain, you know this company. Frey Ranch, Nevada of all places. Farm raised, distilled, aged, and bottled in Nevada. And one of my favorites that I'd never thought I'd like, these guys make bourbon. I thought they just made wine. Redwood Empire, California. So, bourbon doesn't have to come from Kentucky. In fact, by law, bourbon just must be produced in the United States. Kentucky is just the best known, and a lot of that's because some of the biggest distilleries are located in Kentucky. Bardstown, Louisville, places like that. But there's a lot of good brands that aren't in Kentucky. In fact, I showed you a few of them. There's also a lot of brands in Tennessee and Texas, well-known brands that you probably consume and never really thought, well, yeah, this isn't a Kentucky bourbon. It's actually someplace else. So, myth number 1, busted. Myth number 2. I like this one, and I never really even thought about it, but I can understand how people would believe it. Myth number 2, bourbon continues to age in the bottle. Well, it just makes sense, right? As it gets older, it ages and gets better. Well, that might be true for wine, but not true for bourbon. Why? Because the aging process stops once it's dumped from the barrel. It's that process, that interaction over seasons, over years of that whiskey going in and out of the wood, temperature declines, increases, that brings all those tannins and flavors out of the charred oak barrels, gives us its mellowness, and determining where it is in the rickhouse, where it is in the warm and cold climates, can affect the taste of the whiskey and the quality of the whiskey. So it does not continue to age in the bottle. It gets bottled, and pretty much as long as it stays uncorked, stays unopened, it's going to stay just fine. It's whiskey, it's bourbon. You don't have to worry about it. It's not a can of beans like, oh, it expired, throw it out. Now, is there exceptions to that? I'm sure there are. If you put your whiskey, unopened or not, in the windowsill and it's hit by sunlight all the time, it's probably going to degrade. If you keep it in a hot closet all the time, it's probably going to degrade. If it freezes and unfreezes all the time, and I don't know how cold it'd have to be for that, it's probably going to degrade. And unfortunately, when you open it, it's going to start to degrade over time. It's called oxidation. But unopened, just like this, well, this one's open. Unopened, it's going to be just fine. Just keep it out of the sunlight, keep it out of the heat. You'll do just fine. You'll never know that this thing was bottled 5 years ago when you're just getting to it. Won't matter, I promise you. So myth number 2, busted. Myth number 3, I never even thought of this one. I saw it. Bourbon barrels are reused over and over to age bourbon. I don't even know where that came from. By law, bourbon has to be aged in new charred oak barrels, or it cannot be labeled bourbon. Now, this is different from finishing. You'll see all the time where, I'm finished in French oak or this or that. They put staves in it. No, that's after the bourbon has done its aging. Its age stated being 2 years, 4 years, 6 years, whatever that bourbon is being stated as this age. They're talking about in those original American oak barrels. They're not talking about a finishing process that can be weeks or months in another barrel, or they're throwing staves in, whatever, to finish that, to give it that specific flavor, that specific enhancement they're looking for. So finishing a bourbon has nothing to do with aging a bourbon. Those bourbons are aged in brand new American oak barrels. And that's why there's a huge industry making these oak barrels. So myth number 3, busted. Myth number 4. I actually believed that when I was new to whiskey. So I will tell you that, this was one of the ones that I thought was true. That higher proof bourbon equals better tasting bourbon. I'll tell you right now, this Widow Jane Decadence is 91 proof, and it breaks that, it busts that right there. Higher proof bourbon does not mean automatically it's better tasting. Now, I will tell you there's a lot of cask strength bourbons or barrel proof bourbons. To me, it's the same thing. I know there might be a distinction. I think it's the same thing. If they're not diluting it, it's coming straight out of the barrel or cask at whatever proof, then you're pretty much getting an undiluted version, and it's going to have its most intensity of taste. Sometimes you get a lot of ethanol with that, and especially in the younger ones. They'll do this, do a cask strength bourbon that's only 2 or 4 years old. I promise you, a lot of times I can pick up that ethanol. I have to let it breathe a long time before I don't pick it up in either the aroma or the taste. So, it's not true that it automatically makes a better tasting bourbon because it's higher proof. A lot of the factors in there, including age. Have they aged that in the barrel sufficient enough that that mellowness through the charcoaling of the barrel, the charring of the barrel, has basically helped that ethanol to dissipate? And is it finished, or some other method that actually, do they throw it through charcoal filters like some companies do in Tennessee? And you probably know one of them. Doesn't mean it's not a bourbon. It just means they're filtering it through the charcoal to mellow out and then get rid of any of those ethanol flavors. So, higher proof doesn't equal better taste, but some of the most favorite bourbons I have are in a cask strength, but depending on the entry proof they put it in it, the cask strength doesn't mean it's always 125 or higher. Maker's Mark, for example, puts their bourbon in at a lower entry proof. So their cask strengths tend to be 110. not 120, not 130, not hazmat. So, higher proof does not equal better taste. That myth, busted. So, we get to our last one, which I think is the most interesting one, and probably the most controversial one. Myth number 5, older bourbon is better bourbon. Well, there is a lot of older bourbons that are better. I've got an Elijah Craig single barrel 18-year that's absolutely wonderful. When I get about halfway through it, I'm going to start seeking a backup, another one, because I think it's fabulous, and I think it's because of that age. But I've had other bourbons that are old bourbons that I didn't care for. I thought were just too oaky, and that's the side effect. Because this isn't Scotch. You know, a lot of times Scotch, you hear of a 20-year-old Scotch or a 15-year-old Scotch. People say, oh man, the older the better. Now, I'm not a Scotch drinker, so I can't really say that that is necessarily always true. There's probably exceptions there as well. But bourbon is more complex. And I think over time, that bourbon can draw too much of that oakiness, too much of the tannins out. And depending how it's bottled, whether it's diluted or not, whether it's filtered or not, sometimes those tastes from being that barrel can be too long. I think my sweet spot is probably 12 to 15 years on most bourbons, the Elijah Craig being the exception. I don't taste tannins or over oakiness or anything, but the Elijah Craig is diluted. You're not getting it at cask strength. So kind of like if you're getting an old bourbon at cask strength, you're more likely to pick up some of the bad side of aging, which would be oakiness and tannins that you would not get if it was diluted or blended. So my view is 12 to 15 is a good age for bourbon. I think once it gets past 18, I think it's a diminishing return. Personal opinion. So, myth number 5, busted, sort of. There are exceptions. There are bourbons out there like the Pappy 23, which is a wheated bourbon. People will tell you what they just will die for. I've never had the Pappy 23. If you have a sample you want to send me, I'll give you my address. But I have had the Pappy 15, the Knob Creek 18, the Elijah Craig 18, a lot of 12 to 18-year-old bourbons, and to me, that age is perfect. Anything older, you're probably just going to pay more money for. But that's up to you. So, really only you can decide if it's worth the cost to get a 20-plus-year-old bourbon. Now, if you're a collector, that's a different story. We're talking about basically, is it better? Not is it worth more? So, we hope you like this video. We'll comment and share. And if you've got a bourbon myth you'd like us to discuss, put it in the comments, and we'll do another show on bourbon myths because there's a lot of them out there. So as always, please drink responsibly, never drink and drive, and we'll see you next time.